In 1963, when racial tensions in the South were boiling over and the civil rights movement was lighting up the streets of America, Sheriff Tom Jenkins made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his position in the Deep South gave him power that couldn't be challenged. He thought his reputation with the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that had terrorized and oppressed for decades, made him untouchable. He never expected that his actions would bring him face to face with the one man who embodied the spirit of Harlem street justice, Bumpy Johnson. Jenkins had no idea that a simple act of oppression against the black community would ignite a reckoning led by a man whose name was whispered with both reverence and fear in the alleyways and mansions of Harlem alike. This is the story of how Sheriff Tom Jenkins crossed paths with Bumpy Johnson and why, after that fateful encounter, 500 members of the Klan would never wear their white sheets again. Sheriff Tom Jenkins ruled over his county like a tyrant, cloaked in the power of his badge and the fear of his secret affiliations. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair that gave him a distinguished look, Jenkins exuded authority in every movement. He was the kind of man who looked down at his fellow Southerners, sure in his belief that his family's long-standing position of power made him untouchable. What he didn't know was that respect, even in the deepest parts of the South, could not be bought or coerced. It had to be earned. Jenkins was no stranger to the Ku Klux Klan. He had ties to them that ran deep. He used their presence to intimidate and control, but more importantly, to maintain his stranglehold on his county. The sheriff believed that his connections to the Klan made him invincible. They were his personal army, his shadowy enforcers, and they kept him firmly entrenched in power. He saw the people of Harlem, black, poor, and vulnerable, as nothing more than obstacles to the order he had carefully constructed. But what Jenkins didn't understand was the heartbeat of Harlem itself, a sense of dignity and respect that even he, with all his arrogance and power, could not crush. Enter Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name was not just spoken in the streets of Harlem, but held in reverence by everyone who understood the true meaning of respect. Bumpy had spent his life building a kingdom of his own, one where justice wasn't doled out by badges, but by actions. He didn't just command respect, he earned it. Unlike Jenkins, Bumpy didn't need to align himself with hate groups to thrive. He had the people of Harlem on his side, not because of fear, but because of the legacy he had cultivated through loyalty, honor, and fairness. But the sheriff's decision to cross the line would force Bumpy to show the full weight of what true power and respect looked like. Bumpy wasn't interested in petty rivalries or fleeting victories. He was a man who understood that some moments in history demanded justice. This was one of those moments. Sheriff Tom Jenkins didn't care about the lives of black people in Harlem. He never had. In his eyes, they were beneath him. His latest act of brutality was a calculated one. He had orchestrated the lynching of an innocent black man in a small town just outside Harlem. The victim had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, but the sheriff, in his typical fashion, had used the crime to fuel his own power. The Klan came in, as they often did, to handle the dirty work, but Jenkins didn't expect the backlash. This was no ordinary murder. The black community had had enough. But what Jenkins couldn't fathom was that this single act of violence had awakened a sleeping giant, a man who would make it his personal mission to bring justice to those who had long suffered in silence. As news of the lynching spread, Harlem buzzed with outrage. Bumpy Johnson, ever the stoic figure in the shadows of Harlem streets, heard the whispers, felt the anger, and knew it was time to take action. He wasn't just fighting for one man's death, he was fighting for a community's right to live with dignity. For Bumpy, the lines between right and wrong were always clear, but this time the stakes were higher. Jenkins had not only killed a man, but he had also insulted the very core of Harlem's pride. Bumpy couldn't let that stand. This wasn't just about one man. This was about sending a message. Anyone who crossed the line of respect, anyone who tried to destroy the dignity of the people, would face the consequences. Jenkins didn't realize it yet, but his fate had already been sealed the moment he crossed that line. In a town like Harlem, with its deep roots in resistance and justice, there was no room for men like Jenkins, and for 500 members of the Ku Klux Klan, the message would soon become all too clear. It all started with the death of Henry Johnson, a black man wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. Sheriff Tom Jenkins, seeing an opportunity to display his control over Harlem, had ordered his lynching. The story was simple enough to the outside world. Henry was guilty of a crime and justice was swift. But to the people of Harlem, the truth was painfully obvious. Jenkins was using the Klan as his personal enforcers, manipulating them to send a message. The power of white supremacy would not be challenged. On the day of the lynching, Henry's body was strung up on a tree, the message clear: don't step out of line. Jenkins had no doubt that his power would be reinforced, but in the depths of Harlem streets, a storm was brewing. Bumpy Johnson, ever observant, had been hearing whispers of Jenkins's actions, and the word on the streets was simple: the sheriff had gone too far. Bumpy wasn't a man who made decisions in anger, but this was different. The people of Harlem had trusted him, and they knew that he would take action when it mattered. They had been oppressed for so long, but now it was their time to rise, and Bumpy was their symbol. He had built his power on the respect of those who lived and died by the code, a code that would not allow Jenkins's act of violence to go unpunished. Bumpy's connection to the victim wasn't just through blood, it was through principle. Bumpy wasn't just fighting for justice for Henry Johnson. He was fighting for every soul in Harlem who had ever suffered under the boot of oppression. He saw this as a direct challenge to everything he stood for. A man like Sheriff Jenkins could not just walk away from the consequences of his actions. No one had ever dared challenge Bumpy Johnson's authority, and Jenkins would learn that the hard way. The news reached Bumpy through one of his many trusted men, Willie, a young man who had grown up under Bumpy's wing and knew the pulse of Harlem better than anyone. Willie had a way of getting information quickly, and on this day, it was a call from one of his contacts that set the wheels in motion. "Boss," Willie said, his voice tight, "you gotta hear this. Sheriff Jenkins and the Klan, they just lynched a man, Henry Johnson. They say he was a criminal, but everyone knows that ain't true." Bumpy listened, his face calm, his thoughts already in motion. It wasn't anger that flared up inside him. It was something colder, more calculated. He'd seen this kind of injustice before, but something about the way Jenkins had used his power this time felt different. This wasn't just about a man's death. This was about sending a message to an entire community. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the armrest, his mind turning with precision. "I'm going to tell you something, Willie," he said, his voice measured but firm. "This ain't just about Henry Johnson. This is about respect. They think they can walk in here, do as they please, and expect nothing in return. But there's a cost to everything. And right now, Jenkins is paying that price." Willie waited for further instructions, but Bumpy didn't rush. He wasn't the type to react in haste. "We'll make them remember this, Willie. Jenkins wants to remind Harlem who's in charge, but he's forgotten that Harlem has a different king. And I'm not going to let this stand." Bumpy's mind was already formulating his next move. There was no need for grand speeches or elaborate plans. His reputation spoke for itself, and his influence in Harlem ran deep. All he needed was to show up at the right time, in the right place, and make sure Jenkins understood the cost of disrespect. For the next few days, Bumpy allowed the city to buzz with rumors. It wasn't the first time Harlem had been struck by injustice, but this felt different, larger. The sheriff's defiance had shaken the community, and whispers of Bumpy's reaction spread like wildfire. Jenkins, however, felt untouchable. He believed his position, his badge, and his clan connections made him immune to any form of retribution. He continued his daily routine, his arrogance growing with each passing day. He never once considered that his power could be challenged, not even by someone like Bumpy Johnson. Meanwhile, Bumpy moved with the quiet precision of a man who never made a decision in haste. While the sheriff walked around with his usual swagger, Bumpy's men were making preparations, silent, unseen, but every action was calculated. Bumpy wasn't concerned with flashy confrontations or public spectacles. He had learned long ago that real power wasn't shown through loud words or grand gestures. It was delivered quietly, with precision, when the moment was right. Every interaction in Harlem, every move, every whisper was part of his plan. As the days passed, the tension in the air became palpable. The people knew something was coming, but they didn't know when or how it would unfold. Bumpy, ever the strategist, allowed Jenkins to believe that his power was unchallenged. But what Jenkins didn't realize was that Bumpy had already set his trap. On a cool evening in late September, as the moonlight bathed the streets of Harlem in a soft glow, Bumpy received the signal he had been waiting for. Jenkins and his clan members were meeting in a secluded barn on the outskirts of town, an old gathering place where they had long held their secret meetings. It was the perfect time for Bumpy to make his move. Bumpy knew that he didn't need to send an army to make a statement. What he needed was a message, one that would leave a mark on the hearts and minds of every clan member in that barn. It wasn't about violence. It was about making them feel the weight of their actions, to show them that no one, not even the clan, could operate without consequences. Bumpy's men were already in position. The trap was set, and all Bumpy had to do now was walk into that barn and make his presence known. The silence before Bumpy's entrance was thick with tension. The clan members, seated in their usual positions, had no idea that the man they thought was untouchable was about to walk into their midst. Jenkins had made his decision, and now Bumpy was going to make his. It was just past midnight when Bumpy Johnson walked into the barn, his presence commanding the room even before he fully entered. The old wood creaked under his boots as he stepped into the shadows, his silhouette framed by the door. Inside, the 500 members of the Ku Klux Klan sat in a semicircle, engaged in heated discussions about the state of their campaign against the black community. They were unaware that this meeting would be their last, unaware that they were about to face the very man who had become a legend in Harlem. They had no idea that Bumpy Johnson was not just a man, but a force that had been silently shaping the future of Harlem and its people for years. At the center of the room, Sheriff Tom Jenkins stood tall, his arrogant face lit by the low light. He had always believed that his connections, his alliances with the Klan, made him invincible. He was about to learn how wrong he was. When Bumpy's figure appeared fully in the doorway, the room fell into a stunned silence. It wasn't just the suddenness of his appearance, it was the weight of his reputation. Bumpy didn't need to speak. His presence alone spoke volumes. But still Jenkins, never one to show fear, stepped forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Do you know who I am?" Jenkins asked, his voice steady but defensive. He looked at Bumpy with a mixture of disbelief and defiance. He had never imagined that a man like Bumpy, someone from Harlem streets, would dare step into his territory. Bumpy didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang in the air like a thick fog, building tension with every second that passed. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice calm, unshaken. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are, Sheriff, but it's time you learned who I am." The Klan members shifted in their seats, murmurs spreading throughout the room. They were used to intimidation, to power, but Bumpy's presence was different. It was a reminder that respect wasn't something that could be controlled or bought. Bumpy stepped further into the room, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that only years of ruling Harlem could bring. He took a slow, deliberate look around, his eyes locking with those of the Klan members. They were used to feeling untouchable, but now they felt something they hadn't expected: fear. Jenkins, realizing his mistake, tried to stand taller, his bravado faltering. "You can't just walk in here like this, Bumpy," he stammered, his voice betraying his growing unease. "I'll destroy everything you've built. You think you can just come in here and threaten me?" Bumpy's response was immediate and unwavering. "You've been threatening people your whole life, Sheriff, but that stops tonight. You crossed a line, and now you'll answer for it." In that moment, Jenkins realized the gravity of what he had done. The silence stretched on, thick with the tension of impending reckoning. What Jenkins had failed to understand was that Bumpy didn't operate out of fear or anger. He operated out of something far more dangerous, an unshakable sense of justice. And when you crossed that line, you didn't just answer to Bumpy, you answered to the entire community of Harlem. The moment that followed was swift, almost surgical in its precision. Bumpy didn't waste words. He had made his statement, and now it was time for Jenkins to understand the full weight of the justice Bumpy had come to deliver. As the Klan members stood, unsure of what to do, Bumpy reached into his coat, pulling out a single letter. He dropped it onto the ground in front of Jenkins with a controlled, deliberate motion. "This is the cost," Bumpy said quietly. "Your debt to the people of Harlem." The sheriff's arrogance had melted away. His eyes widened as he recognized the document, something that would strip him of everything he had built. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a message that would reverberate across the nation. The letter detailed the full extent of the sheriff's criminal acts, the Klan's involvement, and the complete list of his wrongdoings. Bumpy had orchestrated this moment with such precision that Jenkins knew it was over. The Klan members stood frozen, their eyes darting from Bumpy to Jenkins, realizing that their once untouchable power was crumbling in front of them. For the first time, they saw what real power looked like. Bumpy didn't wait for Jenkins to react. He simply turned and walked out of the barn, his footsteps echoing in the silence behind him. The Klan, for the first time, was left powerless. The aftermath was swift and undeniable. By the morning, the news had spread through Harlem like wildfire. Sheriff Jenkins had been arrested, his criminal activities exposed for all to see. His connections to the Klan were no longer a secret, and his reputation had been shattered beyond repair. But the real story wasn't about Jenkins' fall from grace. It was about the legacy of respect and justice that Bumpy Johnson had cemented that night. Harlem, once again, stood strong in the face of adversity, and its people knew that justice would always have a champion. The Klan, which had once terrorized communities without consequence, was now a shadow of its former self. Their power had been stripped away by a single act, an act of defiance led by a man who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. Bumpy's name was now etched into the annals of history, not just as a gangster or a criminal, but as a man who had changed the course of the fight for justice. The legend of Bumpy Johnson was no longer just about the streets of Harlem. It had transcended the boundaries of race and power and had become a symbol of resistance, respect, and the unyielding fight for what was right. The story of Bumpy Johnson's confrontation with the Ku Klux Klan is one for the ages, a moment when a man whose name had already become legendary in Harlem walked into the lion's den and showed the world what true power really looked like. Bumpy didn't use violence or fear, he used respect, integrity, and a sense of justice that couldn't be broken. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Bumpy Johnson in that moment? Would you have taken the same stand? Would you have been willing to face the impossible to make sure justice was done? If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot. The moments that made him a legend. The code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Sheriff Jenkins? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.